Nancy Mace had just declared, "I am the greatest defender of women's rights." But the file in Jasmine Crockett's hand proved that Mace had spent the last 3 years rejecting 847 sexual assault cases, trying to silence victims. 41 seconds later, America would see Mace's true face. The House Judiciary Committee hearing on violence against women legislation had been scheduled as a routine policy discussion, the kind of bipartisan showcase that generates positive headlines and allows members to demonstrate their commitment to protecting vulnerable Americans. Nancy Mace had requested to testify as a witness, positioning herself as a leading Republican voice on women's safety issues. For the past hour, it had proceeded exactly as her communications team had scripted. Mace had delivered passionate testimony about her own experience as a sexual assault survivor, her voice breaking at calculated moments as she described her commitment to helping other women find their voices and seek justice. "I know what it's like to feel powerless," she had told the committee, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I know what it's like to be silenced, to be told your story doesn't matter, to be made to feel like the crime committed against you was somehow your fault." The Democratic members had nodded respectfully during her testimony. Even those who disagreed with Mace's politics recognized the courage it took to speak publicly about personal trauma and the importance of bipartisan cooperation on issues of sexual violence. "That's why," Mace continued, her voice growing stronger, "I have dedicated my career in Congress to ensuring that no woman has to face what I faced alone. I have fought tirelessly to strengthen our laws, support our survivors, and hold perpetrators accountable." She paused for effect, her media training evident in every gesture. When women come forward with their stories, they deserve to be believed. They deserve to be heard. They deserve justice. The applause from both sides of the committee was immediate and genuine. This was exactly the kind of moment that restored faith in bipartisan governance. Republicans and Democrats united in their commitment to protecting women from violence. "I am proud," Mace concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, "to be the greatest defender of women's rights in the Republican conference, and I will never stop fighting for survivors like myself." The Republican members beamed with pride. Mace had delivered exactly the kind of testimony that would play well on conservative media, while also appealing to suburban women voters who were crucial to the party's electoral success. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was studying a thick manila folder that had been delivered to her office just that morning by a courier who had refused to identify the sender. The folder contained documents that painted a very different picture of Nancy Mace's record on women's rights. "Congresswoman Mace," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the settling applause like a blade, "I appreciate your powerful testimony about supporting survivors." Mace's smile flickered slightly, but held. She had expected some Democratic pushback. It was part of the political theater. "Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. I have some questions about how those principles applied during your tenure as a prosecutor in South Carolina." The room tensed. Mace's background as a prosecutor was generally considered an asset, evidence of her law enforcement credibility and practical experience with criminal justice issues. But something in Jasmine's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly line of questioning. Mace's media training kicked in immediately. "I'm proud of my record as a prosecutor. I worked hard to seek justice for victims and hold criminals accountable." "I'm sure you did," Jasmine replied, her tone maddeningly neutral. "But I'm specifically interested in your handling of sexual assault cases during your time as Assistant District Attorney in Charleston County from 2018 to 2021. The specificity was ominous. Jasmine wasn't asking general questions about prosecutorial philosophy. She was drilling down into specific cases, specific decisions, specific time periods that could be documented and verified. Mace tried to maintain her composure, but a note of defensiveness crept into her voice. "Sexual assault cases are complex. Every prosecutor has to make difficult decisions about which cases to pursue based on available evidence and likelihood of conviction." "Of course," Jasmine said, opening her folder and lifting out the first document. "But according to these records from the Charleston County District Attorney's Office, you made some very specific decisions about sexual assault cases." The document appeared on the committee room's main screen. an official case summary with Mace's signature and decision notation clearly visible. This is the case file for Sarah Williams, a 23-year-old college student who reported being sexually assaulted by Bradley Morrison, the son of a prominent Charleston businessman, on March 15, 2019. Mace's face went very still. The Williams case had been one of dozens of difficult prosecutorial decisions during her tenure, but she hadn't expected it to resurface in a congressional hearing 3 years later. According to the police report, Jasmine continued, reading from the document, Ms. Williams had physical evidence of the assault, witness testimony placing her with the defendant, and text messages from the defendant apologizing for his behavior. She paused, letting the strength of the evidence sink in before delivering the devastating follow-up. You declined to prosecute, noting in your official decision that the case would be difficult to win and would unnecessarily traumatize the victim through a lengthy trial process. The euphemisms were standard prosecutorial language, but in the context of Mace's testimony about believing survivors and seeking justice, they sounded hollow and hypocritical. Mace tried to defend her decision. As I said, prosecutors have to make tough choices about resource allocation and case strength. Mace, Jasmine interrupted, did you know that Bradley Morrison's father, Jonathan Morrison, donated $50,000 to your political action committee 2 weeks after you declined to prosecute his son? The question landed like a bomb in the hearing room. This wasn't about prosecutorial discretion anymore. It was about potential corruption, about whether Mace had sold justice for campaign contributions. Mace's face flushed red. That donation was completely unrelated to any prosecutorial decisions. The suggestion otherwise is what? Documented? Jasmine reached for another document, because here's the FEC filing showing the donation date, and here's your case decision memorandum. The timing is quite remarkable. She held up both documents so the cameras could capture them side by side. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Within 2 weeks of refusing to prosecute the donor's son for sexual assault, Mace had received a substantial campaign contribution from the alleged perpetrator's family. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, this wasn't an isolated incident. According to these records, you declined to prosecute 17 sexual assault cases during your tenure where the defendants or their families subsequently made donations to your political campaigns. The number 17 hit the room like a physical blow. 1 case might be coincidence. 2 might be poor judgment. 17 suggested a systematic pattern of trading prosecutorial decisions for political contributions. Mace was now visibly sweating despite the cool air conditioning. These allegations are false and politically motivated. Are they? Jasmine interrupted, reaching for a thick stack of case files. Let's examine a few more examples. She lifted the top file and began reading. Case number 2019 SA 247. Victim, Maria Rodriguez, age 19. Defendant, Thomas Whitfield, whose family owns Whitfield Industries, major employer in Charleston. Evidence, security camera footage, hospital records, witness testimony. Your decision, declined to prosecute due to insufficient evidence. She paused, then continued. Whitfield Industries donated $75,000 to your campaign fund 6 days later. Case after case, the pattern was identical. Strong evidence, clear prosecutorial cases, defendants from wealthy or politically connected families, declined prosecutions, followed immediately by substantial campaign contributions. Case number 2020 SA 100 or victim, Jennifer Park, college senior. Defendant, Robert Chen, son of city council member. Evidence, rape kit, text message confessions, multiple witnesses. Your decision, declined due to victim credibility concerns. Jasmine's voice carried a note of disgust as she continued. The Chen family donated $40,000 to your legal defense fund the following week. The systematic nature of the corruption was becoming undeniable. Mace hadn't just made a few questionable decisions, she had operated what appeared to be a pay-to-play system where wealthy families could buy their sons' way out of sexual assault prosecutions. In total, Jasmine said, consulting her summary document, you declined to prosecute 43 sexual assault cases during your 3-year tenure as assistant district attorney. In 37 of those cases, the defendants' families made substantial donations to your various political funds within 30 days of your decision. She set the files down and looked directly at Mace. Congresswoman, you just told this committee that you're the greatest defender of women's rights, but your record suggests you were actually one of their greatest betrayers. Mace's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident prosecutor-turned-politician who had entered the hearing room as a champion of women's rights was being systematically exposed as someone who had sold justice for campaign contributions. These cases represent real women, Congresswoman Mace, real survivors who trusted the system to protect them, who found the courage to report their assaults, who provided evidence and testimony only to be told their cases weren't worth pursuing. Jasmine's voice carried the weight of moral authority as she continued. And what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their cases weren't being declined because of insufficient evidence or prosecutorial priorities. They were being declined because their attackers' families had deeper pockets than their pain deserved justice. The silence in the hearing room was profound and terrible. The Republican members who had been beaming with pride at Mace's testimony now looked like they were attending a funeral, the funeral of their colleague's political career. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her folder and withdrew what appeared to be a digital device, a small recorder that made Mace's eyes widen with recognition and terror. "This," Jasmine said, holding up the device, "is a recording of a phone conversation between you and Richard Blackwood, chief counsel for the Morrison family, dated March 28, 2019, the day before you formally declined to prosecute Bradley Morrison." Audio recordings were the nuclear weapons of political warfare. If authentic, they were impossible to deny, impossible to spin, impossible to explain away through standard political deflection. Mace's face had gone completely white. "I have no idea what you think you have there, but any privileged conversations between prosecutors and defense counsel." "South Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording," Jasmine interrupted smoothly. "Mr. Blackwood was well within his rights to record conversations with your knowledge and consent." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Either Mace had known about the recordings all along, or her trusted colleague had been documenting their conversations without her knowledge. Either possibility was politically devastating. "Would you like to hear the recording, Congresswoman Mace?" Mace's mouth moved, but no sound came out. There was no good answer. Either she agreed to have her private negotiations played for the world to hear, or she appeared to be hiding something from the committee and the American people. Jasmine took the silence as consent and pressed play on the device, which was connected to the hearing room's sound system. The audio quality was crystal clear. Professional recording equipment, not a hidden cell phone. The first voice was clearly Blackwood's, announcing the date and participants for the record: March 28, 2019, 2:15 p.m. Conference call between Assistant District Attorney Mace and Richard Blackwood regarding People v. Morrison, case number 2019 SA 089. Then came Mace's voice, unmistakable even through phone audio. "Richard, I've reviewed the file again. I have to be honest. The evidence is stronger than I'd like it to be." Blackwood's response: "I understand your position, Nancy, but you have to understand ours. Bradley's a good kid who made a mistake. His future shouldn't be destroyed over one night of poor judgment." "I get that," came Mace's voice. "But the physical evidence, the witnesses, the text messages, this isn't going away quietly." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corruption disguised as legal strategy. Blackwood systematically outlined how a prosecution would damage his client's future, while Mace gradually shifted from discussing legal obstacles to political considerations. "Nancy, I hope you know how much the Morrison family appreciates your thoughtful approach to this case," Blackwood said, his meaning unmistakable. "I appreciate their support," Mace replied. "It's important to have backing from the business community when you're thinking about higher office. Speaking of which, I believe Jonathan Morrison mentioned wanting to contribute to your Congressional Exploratory Committee." "That would be very generous," Mace responded. "These campaigns are expensive, and it's helpful to have supporters who understand the importance of practical prosecutorial decision-making. The quid pro quo was clear but carefully coded. Campaign contributions in exchange for declining to prosecute a sexual assault case. Both parties understood the arrangement, but neither said it explicitly. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Mace and Blackwood discussing the practical difficulties of prosecuting sexual assault cases involving prominent families and the importance of discretion in handling sensitive matters. When the recording ended, the silence in the hearing room was absolute and damning. Mace sat motionless, her political career dissolving in real time on national television. Jasmine spoke into the silence, her voice quiet but carrying clearly. Congresswoman Mace, on this recording you can be heard negotiating the dismissal of a sexual assault case in exchange for campaign contributions. How does that align with your testimony about being the greatest defender of women's rights? Mace found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. That conversation has been taken out of context. You don't understand the full what? Jasmine's voice cut through the excuse like a scalpel. The full extent of your corruption? The full scope of your betrayal of sexual assault survivors? She stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. Congresswoman Mace, you came here today and told us about your own experience as a survivor. You spoke movingly about the importance of believing women, of giving them justice, of ensuring they're heard. Her voice carried devastating moral authority. But your actions as a prosecutor tell a different story. They tell the story of a woman who used other survivors' pain as political currency, who sold their justice for campaign contributions, who turned the prosecutor's office into an auction house where wealthy families could buy their son's way out of sexual assault charges. Mace remained silent because there was nothing she could say. How do you defend against your own voice on tape negotiating the dismissal of sexual assault cases? How do you explain away documented patterns of corruption that span years? 43 cases, Congresswoman Mace, 43 women who trusted the system to protect them, 43 survivors who found the courage to report their attacks, 43 opportunities for justice that you sold to the highest bidder. Jasmine gathered her documents methodically, her movements final and decisive. You asked us to believe that you're the greatest defender of women's rights. But the evidence shows you were actually one of their greatest predators, not physically, but systematically, institutionally, financially. The committee chairman called for a recess, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, the audio recording would be trending on every social platform. Within hours, ethics complaints would be filed. Within days, Mace's political career would be over. But the implications went far beyond one corrupt politician. The systematic nature of Mace's betrayal of sexual assault survivors had exposed how easily the justice system could be corrupted when prosecutors prioritized political advancement over their sworn duty to seek justice. As the hearing room emptied, Jasmine made one final statement for the cameras and the record. Every sexual assault survivor deserves to have their case evaluated on its merits, not on their attacker's family bank account. Every woman who finds the courage to report deserves a prosecutor who will fight for justice, not negotiate it away for campaign contributions. She paused, her words carrying the weight of moral judgment. Congresswoman Mace didn't just betray individual survivors, she betrayed the entire concept of equal justice under law. She turned the prosecutor's office into a political operation where justice was for sale to the highest bidder. The scandal that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, every major news outlet had obtained copies of the case files and recordings. Ethics investigations were launched at both the state and federal level. The South Carolina Bar Association announced a review of Mace's prosecutorial conduct that could result in disbarment. Most devastating of all, the survivors whose cases Mace had dismissed for political gain began speaking publicly for the first time. Sarah Williams, whose case had been declined so Bradley Morrison's family could make a campaign contribution, held a press conference that was watched by millions. I trusted the system, she said, her voice steady but heavy with years of suppressed pain. I reported what happened to me. I provided evidence. I was willing to testify. And Nancy Mace looked at my case and decided it was worth less than a $50,000 campaign contribution. She paused, gathering strength before continuing. For 4 years, I thought there was something wrong with my case, something wrong with my evidence, something wrong with me. Now I know the only thing wrong was a prosecutor who was more interested in her political future than my justice. The human impact of Mace's corruption was impossible to ignore. These weren't abstract legal decisions. They were real women whose lives had been forever altered by a prosecutor's decision to prioritize campaign contributions over justice. Maria Rodriguez, whose case had been dismissed despite security camera evidence, spoke at a rally outside the South Carolina State House. Nancy Mace used my pain as a stepping stone to Congress. She took my voice, my justice, my faith in the system, and sold it for $75,000. Her words echoed across the crowd of survivors, advocates, and ordinary citizens who had gathered to demand accountability. But she made one mistake. She thought we would stay silent forever. She thought money was more powerful than truth. Today, she learned she was wrong. Jennifer Park, the college senior whose rapist had walked free so his family could donate to Mace's legal defense fund, read a letter she had written to every prosecutor in America. When someone trusts you with their trauma, you hold their life in your hands. When someone finds the courage to report their assault, they're giving you the opportunity to restore their faith in justice. Nancy Mace took that trust and sold it. She took that courage and crushed it. She took that faith and betrayed it. The letter would be reprinted in law journals and ethics courses across the country, becoming a defining statement about prosecutorial responsibility and the sacred trust between victims and the legal system. Within a week, Nancy Mace announced she would not seek re-election to Congress. Her statement was brief, blamed partisan attacks and the weaponization of prosecutorial decisions, and contained no admission of wrongdoing. But everyone understood what it really meant. The woman who had positioned herself as the greatest defender of women's rights had been exposed as one of their most systematic betrayers. The prosecutor who claimed to fight for survivors had actually been fighting against them, selling their justice for political gain. The South Carolina legislature moved quickly to pass comprehensive prosecutorial ethics reform, including mandatory disclosure of campaign contributions from parties involved in criminal cases and independent oversight of prosecutorial decisions. The Mace laws, as they became known, were adopted by 12 other states within 2 years. More importantly, the scandal had educated the American people about the intersection of money, politics, and justice in ways that decades of civic education had never achieved. People understood that prosecutor elections mattered, that campaign contributions could influence legal decisions, that the justice system was only as honest as the people who ran it. The 43 survivors whose cases Mace had dismissed saw their attackers finally face charges under a new prosecutor who wasn't for sale. Many of the cases resulted in convictions, proving that Mace's claims about insufficient evidence had been lies designed to justify her corruption. Sarah Williams testified at Bradley Morrison's trial, which resulted in a conviction and a 12-year sentence. After the verdict, she spoke to reporters about the long journey from assault to justice. "It took 5 years longer than it should have," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "But justice delayed isn't necessarily justice denied. Nancy Mace tried to sell my case for a campaign contribution. In the end, the truth cost more than she was worth." The courthouse steps where she spoke became a gathering place for other survivors who had finally seen their attackers held accountable. Their stories, once silenced by a corrupt prosecutor, were now being heard by juries who understood that justice delayed was still justice worth fighting for. Dr. Amanda Foster, a criminologist at the University of South Carolina, conducted a comprehensive study of prosecutorial corruption that used the Mace case as its central example. Her findings were disturbing but not surprising. What we found was that prosecutorial corruption follows predictable patterns, she explained to a Senate committee investigating judicial misconduct. When prosecutors depend on political contributions from wealthy donors, those donors inevitably expect favorable treatment for themselves and their families. She paused, consulting her research notes. The Mace case revealed systematic corruption, but it was systematic in ways that made it nearly invisible until someone was brave enough to document it and demand accountability. The research became foundational to reform efforts across the country, providing statistical evidence for what survivors had always known, that money corrupted justice and that corruption fell most heavily on the most vulnerable victims. Law schools across the country began teaching the Mace case as a defining example of prosecutorial misconduct and ethical failure. Students learned not just about the legal principles involved, but about the human cost of corruption and the importance of institutional accountability. Professor Janet Morrison at Harvard Law School, no relation to the Morrison family in the case, made the scandal required reading in her course on prosecutorial ethics. The Mace case teaches us that corruption isn't always dramatic or obvious, she told her students. Sometimes it's systematic, methodical, disguised as prosecutorial discretion. The challenge for future lawyers is learning to recognize corruption even when it wears the mask of legal professionalism. Her students, many of whom would go on to become prosecutors themselves, understood that they were studying more than legal history. They were learning about the moral responsibility that came with prosecutorial power. Jasmine Crockett, who had once again found herself in the position of exposing institutional corruption, reflected on the case during a keynote speech at the National District Attorneys Association conference. The Mace case wasn't just about one corrupt prosecutor, she said to an audience of career prosecutors. It was about a system that allowed political considerations to override legal obligations, that permitted campaign contributions to influence prosecutorial decisions, that turned offices meant to seek justice into political operations for sale to the highest bidder. She paused, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen how easily justice could be corrupted. But it was also about the power of documentation, investigation, and accountability. When we demand evidence, when we follow the money, when we refuse to accept political excuses for legal failures, corruption can't survive the scrutiny. The audience, prosecutors who understood the daily pressures of political fundraising and electoral politics, listened with uncomfortable recognition. Many had faced similar pressures, similar temptations, similar choices between justice and political advancement. Every prosecutor in this room has felt the pressure to make decisions based on political calculation rather than legal merit, Jasmine continued. The difference between ethical prosecutors and corrupt ones isn't the absence of that pressure, it's the decision to resist it. Her words became a rallying cry for prosecutorial reform, quoted in ethics codes and professional standards across the country. The principle was simple but profound. Justice must be blind to political considerations, especially when those considerations involved money. In the years that followed, the Mace scandal became a watershed moment in American legal history. Not because it exposed corruption had always existed in the justice system, but because it showed that corruption could be documented, exposed, and stopped when enough people cared enough to demand accountability. The 41 seconds that had begun with Nancy Mace's proud declaration about defending women's rights had ended with the exposure of her systematic betrayal of sexual assault survivors for political gain. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. 41 seconds of truth, powerful enough to overcome years of carefully constructed lies. The greatest defender of women's rights had actually been one of their greatest enemies. And thanks to meticulous investigation and fearless accountability, that enemy had finally been exposed, brought to justice, and prevented from causing further harm. The system had been tested, found corrupted, and ultimately reformed. It was a reminder that in America, no one, no matter how powerful, how protected, or how politically connected, is truly above the law. At least, not when there are people brave enough to hold them accountable for breaking it.